What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're talking auction drafts, specifically the strategies you need to know in order to be able to dominate this type of format. Everything from the basics to the ins and outs and advanced strategies that will give you a leg up on your competition. We'll discuss how you should approach your 2020 auction draft and other auction drafts in general. So make sure to tune in. This will be extremely important. And in the meantime, before we get into it, for everyone interested, go ahead and check out the all-new updated website at alldaypigskin.com for some exclusive content, along with getting yourself a copy of the 2020 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. It's got everything you could possibly want at a great value. Top 150 overall player rankings in standard PPR formats, individual player tiers, rankings, bios, projections, along with general fantasy advice. All the details in the description. And if you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. But for now, let's get right into it. So before getting into our in-depth breakdown, I do want to have a quick general overview of the auction draft itself, because not everybody is going to have that same experience. In fact, you could be going to this year doing an auction draft for the very first time. And I truly want this video to be that all-inclusive source of information for everything auction draft related. So let's start with the basics. What's the difference between a snake draft and an auction draft? Well, as you probably already know, a snake draft is a round-by-round selection based on draft positioning of best player available. Simple enough, right? Well, good news. Even though an auction draft is pretty different, it's also pretty simple in theory. As the name suggests, it is a nomination and bidding process. And that means this essentially eliminates draft order. And that's the beauty of this whole thing, because that means you can go ahead and land any single player that you want. In fact, multiple elite players even, as long as you're willing to pay the price. And speaking of price, also know that everybody in your league starts out with the exact same budget that they use to bid and build out their rosters with. Usually that's $200, but it'll vary from platform to platform based on league settings. Also, when it's your turn to nominate somebody, know that you can nominate anybody that your heart desires at any single position that you want. And when you do so, they will have an average price associated with them so that you can use that as a reference point. And obviously, not every single time will that price be met. Sometimes it could be a little bit less. Sometimes it could be a little bit more. But honestly, in terms of the auction draft process itself, that's it in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and move on to pre-draft prep and some of the similarities that actually exist between snake drafts and auction drafts. And let's start with practice, because I think this is one of the keys every single year. And this is how people can go ahead and differentiate themselves from the competition. And obviously, a mock draft is the single best resource that you can rely in terms of practice. And it's actually even more so important in auction drafts. The reason for this is because this is where you essentially build out your player baseline in terms of pricing. By doing so, you can essentially later on be able to identify when a single player is being overbid or underbid and know whether that player is undervalued or overvalued. And that allows you to go ahead and get the most bang for your buck and wind up with the best player on your roster. Now, something that we also want to mention is that when it comes to practice with mock drafts, with auction drafts, you should pretty much exclusively be using the platform that you will be drafting on during your actual draft date. And the reason for this is because you'll quickly find out that every single platform has a different pricing baseline. So just because player A is priced one way on ESPN, that doesn't mean they'll be priced the same way on Yahoo, for example. So just because you can come out with one roster on ESPN doesn't mean you're going to be able to come out with that roster on Yahoo. And that can be a game changer, because if you go into your actual draft having practice on different platforms and see that one player is ranked or priced for $10 more, well, that means you now have to adjust the way that you bid and go ahead and land players for the remainder of that draft. That could be the difference between an RB1, an RB2, a wide receiver 1, a wide receiver 2 later on. So keep that in mind. And something that we also suggest here that is actually pretty useful that you can't quite do to the same extent in snake drafts is go ahead, open up the menu for your auction draft and whatever the mock draft platform is, and see how much that certain player is priced for that you're interested in. So you know you've got $200. You know that the top end running back is priced for $70. So go ahead, do some simple math, build out your roster depending on the roster size, and see in theory which players you can land, let's say plus minus, $3-4. And you can actually, just by doing this, get a pretty good idea of what your starting roster could look like. And that's extremely valuable. And I feel like not enough people take advantage of this. And speaking of other things, small things that you can take advantage of that many people forget about, is that nowadays, in a lot of leagues, you can go ahead to the year prior and see the auction draft history. Now, obviously, this only applies for leagues that you have been in for more than 1 year, and if you're drafting with people that are consistent, aka people that were in the league the year prior. So it's a little bit of, a twist, but go ahead and see how much your league mates bid on the top end running backs, the top end wide receivers, tight ends, aka the draft history, because you can use those data points to go ahead and analyze to predict how much these top end players will go for this year. And if you know that, then well, okay, the draft tendencies of these players are pretty obvious. And that can be a huge benefit to you, because then you can go ahead and see whether someone was, again, underpriced or overpriced, and to know whether you should go ahead and value running backs more, wide receivers more, quarterbacks, tight ends, whatever the case may be. So go ahead, definitely take advantage of this. Now, let's also go ahead and talk about the positional hierarchy, because no matter what type of draft you're in, whether it's a snake draft, auction draft, the positional hierarchy stays the same. What we mean here is that running backs are king. Not all positions are created equally in fantasy football, and that's still true in auction drafts. That's why you're going to see running backs usually being the most expensive players, followed by wide receivers, then quarterbacks and tight ends. So that positional hierarchy, it holds true in auction drafts just like it does in snake drafts. Running backs are the key to you having that great roster. Let's now talk player evaluations, because I feel like this is something that doesn't get enough coverage in auction drafts, but is so important. And specifically here, what I mean is having a backup to your initial choice. And we honestly preach this when we say practice in mock drafts. Be comfortable selecting another player that you were initially going to target. Be flexible. Don't panic. Because in a snake draft, the comparison to this would be, think about it. It happens every single year to millions of us. We're right there, 1 second away, one pick away from landing that dream player, and then all of a sudden we get sniped. It happens, and it's a part of fantasy football, but it holds even more truth in auction drafts. It just happens a different way, because on top of this, we don't only have to contend with one person sniping us, we have to contend with 8, 9, 10, 11 other people sniping us, depending on your league size, because everybody shares that same mentality in auction drafts of, if I just pay enough money, I will land this guy. But if that produces a bidding war, and it's $10, $15 more than the original suggested price of that player, do yourself a favor and stay out of that bidding process. You should have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D, so on and so forth. Just because you didn't land Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley doesn't mean you can't land an Ezekiel Elliott or an Alvin Kamara or a Dalvin Cook. You get the picture. It holds true at every single position. And on top of this, one way you can further optimize this strategy is having a tier ranking system. Because, again, you're going to see drop-offs at certain points in time. Just because there's one position, let's say running back 12 based on a certain ranking, and running back 13, yes, the separation in position is by only one spot, but this could also be the difference in production of an RB1 and an RB2, and that is a big deal, because you're going to see a drop off in fantasy scoring there. And realistically speaking, you should also see a drop off in pricing in your auction draft. And if it doesn't reflect that, then there's something wrong there. So go ahead and not only have backups to your choices, but have those backups and really all your players tiered, and whatever the position might be. The great thing about this, a lot of platforms have this built in. And if you don't realize it, just take a look at where you all of a sudden see a drop off in $5, $10 between two players that are one right after the other. That's usually in that specific positional group where there's a break in tiers. So go ahead, do yourself a favor, also build in that into your strategy. Transitioning to our in-draft tips and general auction draft mentality that you should have, let's start here. What should you do when it's your turn to nominate a player? Well, unequivocally, 1000% the correct answer is nominate a player you do not want, preferably an expensive player you do not want. And trust us, this is budget management. That is the name of the game in auction drafts, so much so that we will get back to this point. And in this example, essentially, you're nominating a player that you never really wanted, someone that you identified was overvalued and would bust or underperform for one reason or another, and forcing one of your league mates, one of your competitors, to spend 20 to 25% of their starting budget on this player. Then think about it this way again. 2-3 nominations later, there's a player that you actually want, but that aforementioned league mate is also in the bidding process with you. Guess what? Now you can control that bidding process because you've got more money. You can throw your weight around a little bit more so, while your league mate, they have to be more conservative in how they bid because they don't have as much if they want to be intelligent with their budget management. So let's also take this opportunity to address a question we get pretty often, and that's, should we take the opportunity in the early parts of the auction draft to nominate a player that's lower on our rankings but has breakout potential? Because maybe our league mates aren't as likely to focus in on that player. They're more prone to be keeping an eye on the big name guys. Well, flat out the answer is no here, because chances are this breakout is a breakout for a reason and your league mates have identified him as well. And guess what? When people have more money, they're prone to spend it. And that's what happens at the beginning of auction drafts. So don't do yourself a disservice and spend more money at the beginning of a draft on a breakout that you could have gotten later on at a value if you managed your budget intelligently. And here's that phrase again, budget management. Let's address it right now, because if you're not familiar with it, think about it this way. Daily fantasy football. It's a perfect example. It's essentially the same thing as an auction draft, because the goal is to construct the best possible roster while getting the most bang for your buck with your available budget. And if you conclude that process with $15, $20 left over, wouldn't you go ahead and upgrade one of your positions in daily fantasy football? Of course you would. So why wouldn't you do the same thing in an auction draft? That's why you continuously have to be thinking, get the most bang for my buck, get as close to $0 as possible, because if you end an auction draft with $15, $20, that is a huge red flag. That's a failure, because that means you could have spent that extra money to upgrade an RB2 to an RB1. Sometimes $10 is the difference. So the goal should be to get under $10, preferably under $5 if at all possible. Now, with that out of the way, let's also talk about some other points that from time to time people forget when they are in draft, because these auction drafts can be very hectic. One of these points is the max bid, because even though you might start out with $200, your max bid is actually $185. The math here works out. It's max budget that you have minus the empty roster spots on your team. Usually that's 15, so that comes out to $185 to your max bid possible. Now, obviously you would never bid $185, but this is more so important when you've got, $50, $60, $70 left over and maybe have filled out, 4, 5 roster spots, because essentially you can bid only a max of $10 less than what your actual budget is. And that can be a big deal, because you might want to bid up a player, but if you're not possible and you haven't been paying attention to your max budget, then you're going to miss out on that player. The good news is a lot of platforms have this built in, so you just have to make sure you're paying attention here. And also, in terms of paying attention, please, we see it 1,000 times every single year. Pay attention to your draft clock and to the price a player is being bid on, because auction drafts are not as forgiving as snake drafts. In 1, 2, 3 seconds, you can go ahead and miss out a great deal. It'll happen from time to time, naturally. A player that's pretty good value, pretty good projection in terms of fantasy scoring, will go ahead and be nominated and will be close to being bought for maybe $10 less than what their average price is going for. And that's a huge deal. Be the person that gets that discount. Don't be the person that barely misses out on it, because you'll be kicking yourself afterwards. And speaking of, being in that bidding process, let's talk the other side of it, being in a bidding war, because it happens every single year again. You know it, especially at the running back position that's so valued, and with a premier position with a guy like a Christian McCaffrey, a Saquon Barkley, everybody wants that guy. Everybody wants the first overall pick, so everybody is going to want to throw big money at those big name players. Well, sure, okay, you can go ahead and land them too. There's nothing wrong with that, but what happens if the bid gets $10 more, $15 more? And I've seen this happen specifically for those big name players, for the top tier guys. Well, like we said before, have a backup in mind. Have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. If the bidding war gets that high, $10, $15, we urge you. Our general advice there is get out of that bidding war. Don't put yourself in a hole later on. Don't put yourself behind the 8 ball. Give yourself more flexibility later on to build your roster and look at another player. And the last thing we want to mention here is how much of your budget you should be spending on the core of your roster, because statistically speaking, constructing the core of your roster, you're going to spend 80 to 85, 90% of your budget there, and then the rest probably on your bench, depending on the type of strategy that you want to use that we'll mention in a little bit. So theoretically, your core roster is going to go ahead and have spent between, $160, $170 already, just as a pricing point to go ahead and keep in the back of your mind. The core part of your roster is really where the majority of your budget will go. Sometimes that sacrifices depth, but historically speaking, you need 1 or 2 studs to make a difference in an auction draft, and just really generally in any type of fantasy football league. Sure, you can go ahead and accomplish that if you're very lucky through waivers, but it really helps if you can go ahead and land a couple of those studs in your auction draft. So keep in mind, around percentage-wise, what it takes to go ahead and construct that core roster. Finally, getting to our specific auction draft strategies, let's break them down. There's 3 of them. You can be aggressive, you can be balanced, or you can be conservative. Starting with the aggressive strategy, because it seems like many people gravitate towards this one, as it's pretty easy to spend money and it's pretty tempting to land 2 top 10, 2 top 20 players, aka 2 studs pretty early on. We liken this to having 2 first-round selections in a snake draft. And it's nice because you notice that a lot of times teams that have a lot of success in fantasy football usually have at least 2 studs on their team. You can go ahead and help yourself out during the waiver wire process, but that's not always a guarantee. So getting a step up in the draft is a great way to do so. But let's look at the downside, because, well, the problem is you handicap yourself afterwards. You're going to have a major downgrade in production pretty much at every other position, and you're also not going to really have any depth. And if you're looking at the extreme side of this, what if you go ahead and grab a Christian McCaffrey and a Saquon Barkley? Then you're even more so behind the 8 ball. And I've seen people do this. That's why I bring it up. And for that reason, if you're new to auction drafts, don't look at the extreme of the aggressive strategy. Now, looking at the other side of the spectrum, being conservative, what does this mean? Well, essentially, you're waiting until the end of the first round if it's a snake draft, probably the end of the second round, right around there, and getting these type of players, but multiple type of players like this. So the positive here is you won't have that much drop off in production, and you're probably going to have the best bench in your entire league. So those are all great things. But the problem, like we said again, is usually it takes 1 or 2 studs, which your team probably won't consist of, to go ahead and make damage during the fantasy season. Also, another problem with being conservative is what happens, this is the worst case scenario, if multiple people also employ this strategy. Well, essentially, that means that multiple people can then go ahead and have a bidding war on middle tier talent and overpay for it. And that's the worst case scenario, because then you could end up overpaying for a player that essentially costs the same as a tier 1 positional player at that same position. So keep that in mind. Now, looking at the balance strategy, in theory, this is where you are the safest. This is where you essentially get one first rounder, one second rounder, one third rounder if it's a snake draft, so on and so forth. But the problem here is you're not really capitalizing on the aspect of the auction draft. Yes, you're going to have one stud. You're not going to have as much drop off in talent. You'll have some depth, but are you really getting the most bang for your buck? So what's the answer then? What strategy should you employ? And in our opinion, the best thing you can do is be somewhere between a balanced and an aggressive strategy. Get at least one stud, maybe two, and then go ahead and try to the best of your ability to get some depth and also, get at least one good wide receiver as well. Obviously, that's easier said than done, but if you go ahead and keep all the things that we've mentioned up until this point, you'll have a pretty good chance of doing it. And one last thing that we do want to mention is when employing one of these strategies, unlike snake drafts where we preach be flexible, don't go in with a set strategy, that's the exact opposite of an auction draft. Usually, you want to go ahead and go in with a set strategy that you've gone ahead and practiced, because it's really tough to go ahead and start off conservative and then be aggressive. Your budget doesn't really reflect that change in mentality that you might have. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it usually takes a more experienced fantasy auction player to go ahead and pull that off. Now, lastly, I do want to consider the 2020 season and how you should approach auction drafts this year, because this is a year unlike any other with the COVID-19 situation. So in some years, maybe you're gone ahead and stacked players on the same team. Well, should you really go ahead and do that this year? That's a little bit risky, because what if there's an outbreak and all of a sudden you've got two players that you spent a lot of money on sitting out for multiple weeks? So from that perspective, maybe not the best year to go ahead and stack players. If you still decide to do so, at least go ahead and target very high octane offenses. And then the last thing we want to mention is depth, because if you're conservative, then essentially you are purchasing depth on your roster. And to some extent, in this COVID-19 environment, it's going to be good to have depth, because if all of a sudden your roster starts to take hits, the starting part of your roster, then your bench is really going to matter. But the problem is, what's to say that your bench players can't also get sick? So that's not really going to work out from that perspective. So you're still technically better off continuing being somewhere between balanced and aggressive, and then essentially working out that issue on the waiver wire. It's really going to be the waiver wire this year, more important than any other year in fantasy football. So that's how you're going to go ahead and counteract those potential depth issues. So with all that being said, we pretty much wrap up this in-depth breakdown of the auction draft and how you should approach it. Let us hear it in the comments section. Did you agree, disagree? Was this helpful? Do you have any other auction draft questions? We will do our best to answer them. And as we mentioned before, go ahead, check out the all-new website at alldaypigskin.com for more content like this, along with getting yourself a copy of the 2020 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. Great value, and all the details in the description. You get everything you could possibly want. If you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. But in the meantime, we'll see you guys in future videos.